Diane Foster ripped the $5 million check from Ethan Walker's hand and tore it in half in front of his 8-year-old daughter. "Men like you don't walk in here with this kind of money," she sneered, looking him up and down like something she'd scraped off her shoe. Then she called the police to report fraud. Ethan pulled Grace close and told Diane calmly that she had just made the most expensive mistake of her career. As security moved to drag him toward the door, Diane's boss walked in, saw the torn paper on the floor, and went pale. "Mr. Walker," he said. "Why? Before we get into it, if stories like this one hit home for you, go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one." Now let's go back to where it all started. Ethan Walker had learned a long time ago that the world made up its mind about a man before he ever opened his mouth. He was 42 years old, and for the last 6 years, he had been raising his daughter alone in a small house on the edge of Maple Hollow, a quiet town where nobody looked twice at his old sedan, or the jacket he had owned since before Grace was born. His wife had left them both for another man's life in another city, and Ethan had simply kept going because there was no other option that made sense to him. He drove Grace to school every morning, cooked dinner every night, and had never once missed a recital or a parent meeting, not even when work kept him up until 2 in the morning. Nobody at Grace's school knew that the man who showed up in a faded jacket had built Walker Capital Group from nothing into a firm that managed billions of dollars. Ethan preferred it that way. He did not want his daughter growing up believing that money made a person important or that a man's worth could be read off the label of his coat. He wore the same watch he had worn for a decade, drove the same car he had bought used, and kept his success folded quietly into the background of an ordinary life visible only to the people who actually needed to know it existed. That morning, a check for $5 million had cleared into his hands, the proceeds of an early stake he had sold in a technology company most people had never heard of until it made headlines. Ethan already knew where the money was going. Half of it would go into a fund for Grace's future untouched, until she was old enough to understand what it meant. The other half was meant to seed a scholarship for children being raised by a single mother or father, the kind of family he understood better than most, having lived every version of the exhaustion that came with it. He brought Grace along because they had a plan for the rest of the day, one she had been talking about since breakfast. First the bank, then the bookstore, then dinner at the diner she liked on 5th Street. It was supposed to be the easiest stop of the afternoon, a formality before the two of them got back to being father and daughter instead of founder and dependent. Neither of them expected the visit to take more than 10 minutes, and Ethan had even promised Grace she could pick out 3 books instead of the usual one since he was in a good mood. They walked into the Ellsworth branch of Holstead National Bank not long before closing time. Ethan had banked there for 15 years, since before Grace was born, since before Walker Capital had a name anyone recognized outside of a small circle of investors. But the woman behind the manager's desk that day, Diane Foster, had only transferred to that branch a few weeks earlier. She did not know his history, had never pulled up his account, and had no idea that the man in the worn jacket had been a fixture of that building's ledgers for a decade and a half long before she ever set foot inside it. Diane's eyes moved over Ethan the moment he walked in, then down to Grace, then back to the car he had parked out front. Other customers who came through the doors in pressed suits were greeted before they even reached the counter. Ethan and his daughter stood waiting while 3 tellers stayed idle, none of them called forward to help. Grace tugged at her father's sleeve and asked quietly why nobody was helping them yet. Ethan told her to be patient, that it never paid to assume the worst about people before they had done anything to earn it. When Ethan finally reached the counter, he placed the check down and asked for it to be deposited into the account he had held for 15 years. The number on the check caught the teller's attention immediately, and within seconds Diane was standing behind the counter herself. Instead of pulling up his account or checking the history attached to his name, something any manager could have done in under a minute, she began questioning him about where the money had come from, her voice loud enough for half the lobby to hear. Ethan answered every question without losing his composure. He handed over his driver's license, his bank card, his account number, and the paperwork confirming the sale of his shares. He offered to let Diane call the issuing bank directly so she could verify everything herself in a matter of minutes. It was, by any reasonable standard, more than enough for a transaction that should have taken no time at all. Diane looked at the documents without really looking at them. She told Ethan that a man carrying a $5 million check would not be driving a car like his or wearing a coat like that. A young teller named Rachel Simmons offered to make the verification call herself, but Diane cut her off before she could reach for the phone, ordering her back to her own station in a tone that left no room for discussion. By then, several customers had noticed the tension building at the counter, and a few had already taken out their phones to record. One man said loud enough for Grace to hear that a man like Ethan might be using his own daughter to make a scam look more convincing. Nobody in the lobby spoke up against the comment. They simply kept their phones raised, waiting to see what would happen next. Grace's hand found her father's and gripped it tightly, her earlier confidence draining out of her all at once. Ethan kept his voice even and asked Diane one more time to make the call to the issuing bank before this went any further. His calm only seemed to provoke her. In front of the tellers, the security guard and every customer still filming Diane announced that the check was fraudulent, though she had not verified a single detail of it. Ethan reminded her evenly that she was handling a customer's legitimate assets and should think carefully about what she did next, hoping the warning would land before things went any further. Diane heard that reminder as a threat instead of a warning. She snatched the check off the counter, looked directly at Ethan, and told him that people like him did not walk in here with $5 million. Then she tore it in half, and then into smaller pieces, and let them fall to the floor at his feet in full view of his daughter. The lobby went silent. Grace bent down as if to gather the torn pieces, but Ethan stopped her gently, unwilling to let his daughter kneel on the floor to collect what someone had just used to humiliate him. He looked at Diane and told her without raising his voice that she had just made the most expensive mistake of her career. Diane called the police, telling the dispatcher that a man was using fraudulent documents threatening staff and refusing to leave the premises. She then ordered Dean Coleman, the branch's security guard, to escort Ethan out of the building. Dean hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, uncertain why he was being asked to remove a man who had done nothing but stand quietly at a counter, but a direct order from his manager left him little room to argue in front of a lobby full of witnesses. Grace looked up at her father as the guard approached, her eyes wide with a fear no 8-year-old should have had to carry into a bank on an ordinary afternoon. Ethan tightened his hand around hers, keeping his voice low so only she could hear him telling her that everything would be fine as long as she stayed close. Ethan understood the position he was in. He could resist and risk turning a bad situation into something dangerous with Grace standing beside him, or he could stay calm and wait for the truth to catch up to the moment. He chose not to fight the order, but he also refused to walk out the door before someone confirmed what he already knew to be true. He glanced down at the torn pieces of paper scattered across the tile remnants of a scholarship fund that had not even had the chance to exist yet, and felt something harden in his chest that had nothing to do with anger. It was closer to certainty. Somewhere in the last 10 minutes, this had stopped being about a $5 million check and started being about every assumption a room full of strangers had made about him before he ever said a word. He held on to that thought as Dean's hand settled on his arm, and he let himself be walked toward the door, one slow step at a time with Grace pressed against his side. Dean's grip stayed light on Ethan's arm as they moved toward the glass doors, but Grace could not stop looking back at the torn pieces of the check still scattered across the floor. She reached up and wrapped both arms around her father's waist, pressing her face into his side, and begged the guard in a small voice not to take him away. Dean's jaw tightened, but he kept walking, caught between a manager's order and the plain evidence of his own eyes. Diane called out from behind the counter, telling one of the tellers to hold Grace back so the girl could not, as she put it, be used to obstruct an officer of the bank from doing his job. It was the first time Ethan's calm cracked. He had absorbed the accusations about the check, the insults about his car and his coat, even the humiliation of watching his own money torn apart in front of strangers, but the moment someone suggested touching his daughter, his voice changed entirely. He told the teller in a tone that left no room for negotiation that no one was to lay a hand on Grace. Diane seized on that reaction, immediately telling the gathering crowd that his sudden intensity was proof of exactly the kind of aggression she had been warning them about since he walked through the door.
Don't worry, sweetie.
Ethan understood in that instant that every word out of his mouth and every motion of his body was being read through a lens that had already decided who he was before he ever said a word. He lowered his voice, kept his hands visible at his sides, and pulled Grace in close enough that she was standing against his hip rather than anywhere near the guard who had come to take him away. It struck him standing there how quickly a father's instinct to protect his child could be twisted into evidence against him. He had spent 6 years building a life where Grace never had to see him lose his composure, and now a stranger behind a bank counter was rewriting that same protectiveness into something dangerous simply because it suited the story she had already decided to tell about him. Rachel spoke up again the second time she had tried to intervene since the confrontation began. She reminded Diane as steadily as she could manage that Ethan had not threatened anyone, and that a single phone call to the issuing bank would settle the entire matter within minutes. Diane turned on her instead, threatening to fire her on the spot if she said another word out of turn in front of customers who were still filming every second of it. Rachel did not back down entirely, but she stopped talking, aware that losing her job would help no one in that lobby, least of all the man standing beside his frightened daughter. She glanced at Ethan for a moment, and something in her expression suggested she believed him, even if she could not say so out loud without risking her position. Rachel had only been working at the branch for a little over a year, and she had watched Diane dismiss more than one customer in ways that never quite sat right with her. She had told herself each time that it was not her place to say anything, that questioning a manager risked more than it was worth. Standing there watching Grace's face crumple, she understood that whatever she had told herself before no longer held up. The customers who had been recording everything on their phones kept recording. Nobody lowered a phone to speak up. Nobody stepped between Diane and the family she was dismantling in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. They wanted the spectacle, but none of them wanted to be the first person to risk anything by standing on the side of a stranger they had never met before that day. Grace looked around the lobby at all the raised phones and lowered eyes, and she asked her father in a voice just loud enough to carry why nobody in the room would say that he had done nothing wrong. Several people looked away when she said it. Nobody answered her, and nobody moved. Ethan felt that silence settle into his chest harder than anything Diane had said, because he understood watching his daughter's face that she was learning something about the world that no 8-year-old should have to learn in a bank lobby on an ordinary afternoon. He realized, standing there with Grace's hand locked in his, that this had stopped being only about $5 million, or even about his own dignity. His daughter was watching an entire room agree through nothing but silence, that an injustice happening in plain sight did not require anyone to do anything about it. That thought settled into him with more weight than the accusation of fraud ever could, and he found himself wondering what kind of lesson Grace would carry out of that building if nothing changed before they reached the door. Dean began walking Ethan and Grace toward the glass doors at the front of the branch, his hand still resting on Ethan's shoulder rather than gripping it as though some part of him did not want to be doing this even as he did it. The lobby had gone quiet, except for the murmur of customers still filming, waiting to see how the scene would end, and the low hum of the overhead lights that suddenly seemed far too loud. Ethan counted his steps toward the door, the way he sometimes counted his breaths during a difficult negotiation, a habit that kept his mind from racing ahead into anger. Grace's small hand stayed locked around 2 of his fingers, and he could feel her trembling, even though she had stopped crying somewhere in the last minute. He told himself that whatever happened next outside those doors, the most important thing was that she stay close and stay calm, and everything else could be sorted out afterward. Diane watched them go with her arms crossed, apparently satisfied that the matter had been handled correctly, unaware that the man walking toward the exit held more influence over her branch's future than she could have imagined 10 minutes earlier. At that exact moment, the door swung open, and Gerald Whitman walked in a leather briefcase in one hand and the unhurried posture of a man who expected an uneventful, late-afternoon meeting. Gerald was the regional president for the Eastern Division of Holstead National Bank, and he had come to the Ellsworth branch specifically to meet Ethan after hours away from the attention a public meeting might draw. The two of them were finalizing a deal worth $750 million between the bank and Walker Capital Group, a deal that had been months in the making and was scheduled to close within the week. Gerald took 2 steps inside before he understood what he was looking at. Ethan Walker, the man he had been preparing to meet for the better part of an hour, stood with a security guard's hand on his shoulder while his daughter clung to his side in tears. Scraps of paper were scattered across the floor near his feet, and Gerald did not need anyone to explain what they had once been. His briefcase slipped out of his hand and landed with a heavy thud against the tile. For a moment he simply stood there processing the distance between the meeting he had walked in expecting and the scene actually unfolding in front of him, his eyes moving from the torn paper to Grace's tear-streaked face and then to Ethan himself. Then he said the 2 words that changed the entire temperature of the room. "Mr. Walker." Gerald said, his voice carrying across the lobby with an authority that made every head turn. Dean released Ethan's arm, immediately stepping back, as though the shoulder he had been holding had suddenly become something he had no right to touch. Diane moved toward Gerald and began explaining quickly that she had just prevented what she believed was a $5 million fraud attempt. Gerald looked at her for a long moment before asking whether she had any idea who the man standing in front of her actually was. Diane opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, clearly realizing for the first time that the question was not rhetorical. She glanced at Ethan, then at Grace, then back at Gerald, searching for some version of the last 10 minutes that might still make sense in light of what was happening. Around the lobby, the customers who had spent the last several minutes recording a supposed criminal suddenly lowered their phones just enough to exchange confused glances with one another.
Okay.
A woman near the entrance whispered to the man beside her, asking if this meant the whole thing had been some kind of misunderstanding. Nobody answered her because nobody yet understood exactly how large that misunderstanding actually was. In front of every customer still in the lobby, Gerald explained that Ethan Walker was the founder of Walker Capital Group, one of the largest institutional clients the bank currently held. He explained that Walker Capital was in the final stages of a $750 million agreement with Holstead National, and that Ethan was the only person with the authority to approve or walk away from that deal. The $5 million check, he added, was entirely legitimate. The issuing bank had sent confirmation early that same morning, a confirmation Diane had never once bothered to check, before deciding what she believed about the man standing at her counter. Gerald then turned to Grace, lowering himself to her eye level, and apologized to her directly for what had happened inside a bank that carried his name on its letterhead. It was a small gesture, but it was the first time since they had walked through the doors that anyone in the building had spoken to Grace as though her fear mattered, and she looked up at her father as if checking whether it was safe to believe him. 2 words had been enough to reverse everything. The customers who had been filming lowered their phones, though none of them deleted the footage sitting in their pockets. The tellers who had stood frozen behind the counter began exchanging uneasy glances, some of them suddenly finding reasons to look busy with paperwork instead of meeting anyone's eyes. Diane, for the first time since the confrontation began, had nothing immediate to say. The same man who had loudly accused Ethan of using his own daughter to sell a scam now stood near the door studying his shoes, making no effort to apologize or even meet Ethan's eyes. Grace noticed him too, and Ethan felt her grip tighten slightly on his hand, as if she recognized the voice even without looking directly at the man who owned it. Diane straightened her blazer and cleared her throat as though composure alone might undo the last few minutes. She recovered quickly, though, and rather than accepting responsibility, she insisted that Ethan bore some blame for the entire incident. She argued that a man carrying $5 million should have dressed the part, or at the very least identified himself the moment he walked through the door, as if the burden of preventing his own humiliation had rested on him rather than on her. Ethan asked her, without raising his voice, whether a customer needed to be wealthy or well-known before he deserved basic decency. Diane answered by insisting she had only been following procedure, repeating the word twice, as though saying it often enough might make it true. Gerald gestured toward the torn paper still scattered on the floor and asked her to name the exact procedure that authorized a branch manager to destroy a customer's legal property in front of his child. "There is no such procedure, Diane," Gerald said flatly. "There never has been." Diane's face flushed and she started to say something about protocol again before catching herself aware that the word had already failed her once. Diane fumbled for an answer and found none. She looked around the lobby at the tellers who would not meet her eyes and the customers still holding their phones, and for the first time seemed to understand that no one in the room was going to help her out of the corner she had backed herself into. She could not answer Gerald's question. Instead, she pivoted again, this time blaming Ethan for bringing his daughter into the bank at all, suggesting that her presence had made the entire situation more emotional than it needed to be. That comment was the moment Ethan stopped extending her any benefit of the doubt whatsoever, and something in his expression made even Gerald take half a step back. Gerald ordered Diane to surrender her employee badge and her keys immediately, and instructed her not to touch her computer or her phone under any circumstances. Every file and every note attached to her station that day would be preserved for an internal investigation, he told her in front of everyone still standing in the lobby, his voice carrying the flat finality of a decision that would not be reversed by an apology. While attention remained fixed on Ethan and Gerald, Diane quietly slipped behind her terminal and attempted to delete an internal note she had added to Ethan's account only minutes earlier, one that described him as a threatening customer with a high risk of fraud. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard as though she believed the matter could still be cleaned up if she acted fast enough. Rachel noticed the movement out of the corner of her eye and crossed the lobby before Diane could finish placing a hand firmly over the keyboard and stopping the deletion mid-motion. She told Diane plainly that the note needed to stay exactly where it was, then turned to Gerald and informed him that the branch's security cameras had recorded the entire incident from multiple angles, including the moment Diane had torn the check apart in front of Grace. Diane's face went pale at the mention of the cameras, as though she had forgotten entirely that the whole exchange had been captured on film from the moment Ethan walked through the door. Gerald terminated Diane on the spot right there in the lobby, in front of the same customers who had watched her tear the check apart less than 10 minutes earlier. Diane asked to have the conversation privately in an office instead, but Gerald refused her outright. He told her plainly that she had humiliated Mr. Walker in public and that she would answer for it in front of the same people who had witnessed it happen, not tucked away behind a closed door where the consequences might quietly disappear. Turning to Dean, Gerald took a more measured approach. He acknowledged that the security footage showed Dean had never used force against Ethan and had released him the instant Gerald spoke, and he suspended Dean pending a full review rather than terminating him outright, telling him the time off would give both of them a chance to look at the footage clearly before deciding anything permanent. Dean nodded, his shoulders dropping with something between relief and shame. He admitted quietly that he should have questioned Diane's order the moment it was given, instead of following it simply because it came from someone above him. "I knew something felt wrong," he said mostly to himself. "I just didn't trust that feeling enough to say so out loud." Ethan, still holding Grace against his side, found he had no anger left for the guard who had at least had the decency to hesitate before every step, unlike the woman who had ordered him to. The police arrived not long after responding to the call Diane had placed earlier, describing a black man attempting fraud and threatening staff. Two officers walked in, scanning the lobby, and for a brief moment, Ethan felt the same tightening in his chest he had felt when Dean's hand first landed on his arm, a reflexive bracing for another round of assumptions before anyone had asked him a single question. Gerald tried to explain that the initial report had been false, but the responding officers still had to file an incident report since Diane's original call had already been logged as an official complaint before anyone corrected the record. One of the officers apologized for the inconvenience while taking down Ethan's account of events, admitting under his breath that the dispatch call had made the situation sound far more serious than what they were seeing in front of them. Ethan stood through the questioning with Grace still pressed against him, answering each question calmly, even though the entire process felt like a formality, dragging out a humiliation that should have already ended the moment Gerald walked through the door. He kept his answers short and factual, unwilling to let his frustration bleed into anything the officers might misread as agitation. Rachel gave her account of events to the officers without hesitation, describing exactly what she had seen and heard from the moment Ethan and Grace first walked through the doors. She spoke clearly and did not soften any detail, including the moment Diane had threatened to fire her for offering to make a simple phone call. Several customers who had recorded the confrontation came forward as well, handing over video that showed exactly what Diane had said and done from the moment the check hit the counter to the moment it hit the floor in pieces. A few of them apologized to Ethan directly while they waited, admitting they should have said something the moment the questioning started instead of only reaching for their phones. One 10-second clip showing Diane tearing the check and letting the pieces fall at Ethan's feet while Grace watched ended up online before the police had even finished taking statements inside the branch. By the time Ethan and Grace finally left the building that evening, the video already had thousands of views, a number that would multiply many times over before the night was through. Within hours, the clip had spread far beyond Maple Hollow, reaching national attention almost overnight. News vans began appearing outside the Ellsworth branch before the sun had even set, and reporters stood outside the same glass doors Ethan had been walked toward less than a day earlier, asking questions of anyone willing to speak on camera. Reporters quickly discovered that Ethan was a single father who had raised his daughter alone for 6 years, and that the $5 million Diane had torn apart was meant to help launch a scholarship fund for children being raised by single parents just like him. Old photographs of Ethan dropping Grace off at school surfaced online, along with interviews from neighbors who described him as a quiet, private man who had never once mentioned the size of his company to anyone in Maple Hollow. The contrast between what the money was actually meant to do and how its owner had been treated only deepened the public outrage building around the story with every new share and every new headline. Commentators debated the footage for days, and the phrase Diane had used at the counter about people like him not walking in with $5 million was repeated across every major outlet until it became impossible to escape. Local news stations replayed the 10-second clip during every broadcast that week, often followed by panels of guests arguing over what it revealed about how banks treated their customers. A few outlets tracked down Diane's previous employment history, uncovering complaints from years earlier that had never made it past an internal file before that week. Holstead National's stock began sliding as the video circulated, and the bank's board convened an emergency session by that evening, putting pressure on Gerald to do whatever was necessary to keep Ethan from walking away from the $750 million deal. Calls came in from board members who had never once asked about a single branch manager before that afternoon, all of them suddenly desperate to know how quickly the situation could be contained. Gerald spent most of that night on the phone fielding questions from executives who cared far more about the falling stock price than about the girl who had watched her father accused of fraud in front of a room full of strangers. He answered every call the same way, telling them that the only path forward was full accountability, whether or not it was the answer any of them wanted to hear. More than one executive suggested quietly settling with Ethan before the story grew any larger, hoping a private payout might make the entire matter disappear from headlines within a week. Gerald refused each time, telling them plainly that Ethan Walker did not strike him as a man who could be bought into silence, and that trying would likely make things far worse for everyone involved. An internal investigation launched in the following days uncovered a pattern far larger than a single afternoon at a single branch. Diane had a documented history of freezing or denying accounts belonging to black customers, and customers with lower incomes and previous complaints filed against her had been quietly dismissed by branch leadership long before Ethan ever walked through those doors. Investigators found at least a dozen prior complaints sitting untouched in old files, each one closed without any real review. Employees who had stayed silent about her behavior for years suddenly found themselves being asked why nothing had ever been done. Some admitted they had assumed complaints were being handled above their level. Others confessed they had simply been afraid of losing their own jobs if they challenged a manager's decisions in front of corporate leadership. One former teller who had left the branch nearly 2 years earlier told investigators that she had reported an incident almost identical to Ethan's involving an elderly customer whose account Diane had frozen without explanation. That complaint, like the others, had been closed within a week, with no further action taken, buried in a file nobody had reason to reopen until a $5 million check ended up torn on the same lobby floor. What had started as one manager's mistake was quickly becoming proof that an entire system had allowed discriminatory behavior to continue unchecked for years. Within 48 hours, the police formally closed their case, confirming there had been no fraud and no threat of any kind from Ethan, and noting for the record that Diane's original report had been false from the start, a small measure of official vindication that did little to undo what Grace had already witnessed. Diane lost her job and now faced the possibility of losing her banking license altogether, along with a discrimination lawsuit and a formal charge for filing a false police report. Lawyers representing several of her past customers began reaching out within days, asking whether they too had grounds to come forward now that her history was finally being examined. The bank stood to lose the largest financial agreement in its history, and for a moment it seemed as though the entire branch might collapse under the weight of a single torn check and everything it had exposed underneath it. Analysts speculated publicly about whether Holstead National could survive the loss of the Walker Capital deal on top of the reputational damage already spreading across every major news outlet. Ethan's phone did not stop ringing that first night, filled with messages from reporters, lawyers, and even a few distant acquaintances who had never once called him before, but suddenly wanted to know if the rumors were true. He let almost every call go to voicemail, choosing instead to sit with Grace and let the noise outside their small house in Maple Hollow stay exactly where it belonged, on the other side of a door he had no plans to open that evening. But the sharpest blow of all did not come from the board, the lawyers, or the reporters calling for comment. It came from Grace later that evening as she sat across from her father at their kitchen table, picking at a dinner neither of them had much appetite for. She looked up at him and asked whether anyone would have apologized at all if they had not found out he was rich. Ethan set down his fork and looked at his daughter for a long moment, searching for an answer that would not feel like a lie. He had no answer for her. He had been cleared because he happened to hold power that most people never would, but he understood, sitting there with his daughter's question hanging in the air between them, that thousands of other people walked into banks just like that one every single day without a regional president arriving in time to call them sir. He thought about all the videos and headlines already circulating his name, all the strangers online arguing about what had happened to him, and realized that almost none of them were asking the question Grace had just asked at their own kitchen table. Everyone wanted to talk about the check. Almost nobody wanted to talk about what happened to the people who did not happen to be carrying one worth $5 million, or the ones who never got a chance to have their names cleared on the evening news. Outside, he could still hear the faint sound of a car slowing near their house, one of several that had crept past, since the story broke drivers craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the man everyone online was suddenly talking about. Ethan pulled the curtain shut and turned his attention back to his daughter, the only audience that had ever mattered to him in the first place. For the first time since the check had been torn in half, His own vindication felt entirely hollow to him, and he sat with that feeling long after Grace had gone quiet, staring at the last uneaten pieces of food on her plate. He reached over and squeezed her hand, unable to give her the honest answer she deserved, and unable to stop thinking about what he might do instead. The lawyers arrived at Ethan's house 3 days later, dressed in suits that looked out of place against the modest porch and the sedan parked in the driveway. They came with an offer already prepared, one that included a financial settlement, a public apology from the bank, and the termination of several employees, all in exchange for one simple condition. Ethan would sign the $750 million agreement as planned and say nothing further about what had happened inside the Ellsworth branch. They laid the paperwork out across his kitchen table, the same table where Grace had asked her question 3 nights earlier, and walked him through the numbers as though the size of the settlement alone might be enough to settle the matter. Ethan let them finish, before he said anything at all, watching Grace do her homework quietly in the next room, while grown men discussed how to make a public humiliation disappear from the news cycle. Ethan listened to the entire proposal without interrupting, aware that a single signature from him could still cost Holstead National hundreds of millions of dollars and end more than one career at the top of the company. Part of him wanted to walk away entirely, to take Grace somewhere far from cameras and reporters, and never set foot inside another Holstead branch for the rest of his life. He thought about Grace's question from that first night, the one that had followed him into every quiet moment since. If nobody had known he was rich, would anyone have apologized at all? He understood that punishing Diane and pressuring the bank into a public statement would satisfy his own anger, but it would do nothing for the next person who walked into a bank without a regional president waiting nearby to vouch for them. He also thought about the customers who had stood in that lobby with their phones raised, recording everything and saying nothing, and about how easily an entire room had agreed through silence to let an injustice happen in front of them. Punishing one manager would not change that kind of silence. Only something built to outlast the headlines might have a chance. He thought, too, about Dean's admission that he had known something felt wrong and had not trusted himself enough to act on it, and about how many other employees across the country probably carried that same quiet doubt without ever being given permission to speak it out loud. If the bank walked away from this moment having only fired one manager, nothing underneath her would have actually changed. The challenge in front of him was no longer proving that a $5 million check was real. It was proving that power once handed to someone who had felt its absence could be used to protect the people who never got the chance to hold any of it themselves. Ethan told the lawyers he would keep the deal on the table, but he refused the personal settlement outright, telling them he had no interest in being paid to stay quiet. Instead, he laid out a list of conditions that had nothing to do with his own bank account and everything to do with what happened the next time someone without his last name walked through those doors. Every branch would undergo an independent audit for discriminatory conduct conducted by outside investigators rather than the bank's own compliance office. Any decision to freeze or deny a customer's account would require approval from a second manager before it could take effect. Customers would have the explicit right to request independent verification whenever a dispute arose, rather than being left at the mercy of a single employee's judgment. Employees who reported wrongdoing would be protected from retaliation, a condition Ethan insisted on directly because of what he had watched happen to Rachel in the middle of that lobby. Frontline staff, including security personnel like Dean, would receive training on when and how to question an order that was clearly wrong instead of following it simply because it came from someone above them. Security footage and transaction records could no longer be deleted once a complaint had been filed against an employee. Customer rights would be posted publicly inside every branch in plain language anyone could read while waiting in line. The bank would be required to publicly disclose how it had handled every ignored complaint from the past, including the ones already buried in old files before Ethan ever walked through the doors of the Ellsworth branch. Finally, Holstead National would fund a permanent financial assistance program for single-parent families seated with the same money that had once been torn apart on a lobby floor. The board resisted at first, arguing that some of the conditions went far beyond what any single incident required, but with the deal and the company's reputation both hanging in the balance, they had little room left to negotiate. Gerald sat through most of those negotiations himself, reminding the board more than once that the cost of refusing Ethan's terms would almost certainly exceed the cost of accepting them. Within the week, every condition had been accepted and written into the final agreement alongside a public timeline for when each change would take effect across every branch in the region. Diane's banking license was permanently revoked, and she now faced a civil rights lawsuit alongside the charge for filing a false police report. Employees who had helped bury previous complaints against her were placed under formal review as well, closing out a pattern of silence that had protected her for years longer than it should have. Dean was reinstated once the investigation confirmed what the footage had already shown, that he had never used force against Ethan and had released him the instant he was told to. He was placed into the very training program Ethan had insisted on learning alongside other staff how to recognize and refuse an order that crossed a clear line. When he saw Ethan again weeks later, he apologized quietly, admitting he wished he had trusted his own instincts sooner, instead of waiting for someone else to give him permission to do the right thing. Ethan told him there was nothing left to apologize for, that he remembered clearly how Dean's hand had never once tightened on his arm, and how he had let go the instant Gerald spoke. It was a small distinction, but it was one Ethan had carried with him in the weeks since, and he wanted Dean to know it had not gone unnoticed. Rachel was kept on and promoted to assistant branch manager, a new role that put her in charge of rolling out the teller's training program across the region, all because she had been the only person in that lobby willing to speak up while everyone else stayed silent. Ethan made a point of thanking her personally before he left the branch that day, telling her that her willingness to say something out loud had mattered more than she probably realized in the moment. The bank issued a replacement check once the original had been formally voided, and Ethan split the money exactly as he had always planned. Half went into the fund, securing Grace's future. The other half became the seed money for the Walker Single Parent Scholarship, a program built to support the children of mothers and fathers raising kids on their own the way he once had. Ethan insisted that the very first round of scholarships be administered out of the Ellsworth branch itself, the same building that had once refused to believe he belonged there. A place that had turned him and his daughter away would now be the place responsible for handing opportunity to families who looked a great deal like his own. 3 months later, Ethan and Grace walked back through those same glass doors. He still drove the same sedan and wore the same jacket, unwilling to change anything about himself, simply because the world had briefly decided his appearance mattered more than it should have. Grace held his hand the same way she had that first afternoon, though there was nothing tense in her grip this time, only the easy comfort of a child walking beside her father on an ordinary errand. The bank, however, looked different in ways that went beyond fresh paint or new signage. An employee greeted them the moment they stepped inside, asking how she could help before either of them had said a word. Nobody's eyes lingered on Ethan's coat or his car keys before deciding how he should be treated, and for the first time since that first visit, Grace did not ask why nobody was helping them yet. A new placard stood near the entrance listing every customer's rights in plain language, along with a number for an independent complaint line that had nothing to do with the branch itself. Rachel came over to greet them in her new role, mentioning that the first round of staff training had already rolled out across the entire region and that early feedback from other branches had been better than anyone expected. Dean stood near the door in his uniform, and when he caught sight of Ethan, he offered a small, genuine nod, a far cry from the tense hesitation Ethan remembered from 3 months earlier. None of the customers who had once stood filming with their phones raised ever came back to that branch again, and Ethan noticed their absence without needing to say anything about it, understanding that some kinds of silence simply chose to stay hidden rather than be confronted. A small plaque near the wall bore the name of the new scholarship fund. At one counter, a young mother was opening her son's first savings account, met with none of the suspicion Ethan and Grace had faced that same afternoon 3 months earlier. Nobody questioned whether she belonged there. Grace watched the scene for a long moment before turning to her father and asking if that was the reason he had not simply closed the bank down after everything that happened. Ethan thought about it before answering, choosing his words carefully because he wanted her to actually understand them rather than simply hear them. "Closing a door is easy," he told her. "Making it open for everyone is harder." Grace nodded slowly the way she did when she was turning an idea over in her mind rather than simply accepting it. She looked back at the young mother at the counter, then up at her father again, as if measuring the distance between the fear she remembered from 3 months earlier and the calm she was watching unfold in front of her now. Before they left, Ethan let Grace hand the very first scholarship letter to a young student being raised by a single father, watching his daughter's face as she understood for the first time that $5 million had never been what made him matter. What mattered was that he had the power to seek revenge and chose instead to make sure the next person through those doors would be treated like they belonged there from the start. Father and daughter walked out together, finally continuing the plans that had been interrupted 3 months earlier, a stop at the bookstore, then dinner at the diner on 5th Street. If you had been standing in that lobby the day it all began, would you have stayed silent behind a raised phone, or would you have been the first to stand up for a father and his daughter? A person should never need $5 million to be treated with basic respect. Ethan did not win the day Diane's boss recognized him as a powerful investor standing in his own branch. The real victory only arrived once he used that same power to make sure the next person walking through those doors would be treated fairly, no matter who they were, what they wore, or how much money they carried with them. If this story moved, you subscribe for more and carry that same lesson with you the next time you're standing in a room where someone else is being underestimated.